welcome to episode 279 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Michael O'Malley
and Gabby Lewis.
In today's episode, we will be talking about movies that we saw this week in part one, and in part two, we will be getting near the conclusion of our Best of the Decade series with the year 2018. Because I'm sure people who have listened to this podcast for a while forgot about our thoughts about 2018. So we're going to bring those back, retro. Let's go ahead and jump in. We got a bunch of big movies that came out over the Christmas holiday. I'm going to start with probably the smallest one, and that is the latest Star Wars movie. The finale of the Skywalker saga, which Disney created in order to make this feel more important.
Hold on, can I pause about that? The finale. This is the third time that I've been told that this is the last Star Wars movie. Does this one feel any more or less definitively?
It's not the last Star Wars movie. Listen, we're working in a capitalistic system. We're gonna get so much more. This is just the last of like the Luke Skywalker, Leia, Han Solo, all that, like these people series. So there'll be Star Wars after this. But this is like the end of all so you got the prequels, and then you got the original trilogy, and then you got this one. This is the last of like all those movies.
I'll believe it when I don't see it.
Right.
But at the same time, it's Disney, so take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, this is Star Wars Rise of Skywalker. It's J.J. Abrams came back to direct this one after a bunch of man babies complained about Rian Johnson's movie. That was the last one. I think Andrew and I are going to get more in depth on this next week. He saw the movie as well and actually rewatched the entire series of movies with Jesse. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in next week's episode. But I wanted to just talk real briefly about this one. I was not a fan at all of this movie. This is kind of like the epitome of fan service. I'm a pretty strong fan and defender of The Last Jedi. I think it's still very much a corporate product, but when it comes to corporate products, especially Star Wars corporate products, it's probably your best case scenario of a Star Wars corporate product. It kind of has some interesting ideas. It really has a strong philosophy to it that you don't necessarily see in not only Star Wars movies, but just big budget blockbuster Disney movies in general. And I think it kind of took this concept of Star Wars, the mythology of Star Wars, into an interesting direction where it was less on the importance of lineage and kind of the made up mythos of why people should care about these characters, and it was much more about what the strength of why this mythology works and why people are kind of compelled to it. Naturally, that angered all of the people who didn't want to think, and so they brought J.J. Abrams in. He pretty much took that and course corrected everything, and this kind of feels like it's just pretty much literally in dialogue with that movie and trying to correct everything that people did not agree with, or in terms of the direction that the last movie took. I don't know. It starts out with an incomprehensible 30 minutes where it's just kind of running through all of these different sequences and trying to streamline this whole plot where the Emperor character, who people know from the first two trilogies of movies, has been reborn, even though he fell down a giant shaft and was killed by Darth Vader in the original trilogy. He's come back, and he's been behind all of the evil in this series of movies, and they got to stop him. And I was just why? And so the one interesting tidbit that I'll say before I move on from this, like I said, we'll talk about it more in depth. I wrote a review. It's on cinematary.com. It's not very good, so I mean, if you want to go look at it, you can. I don't really think it's that great, so you can skip it if you would like to. But the one thing that I was thinking about, that I actually read a review on Letterboxd that was talking about, and this is, I think, the more interesting question about Star Wars, especially in this iteration, is more about the outside of Star Wars than what's actually happening on screen. Because what's happening on screen is especially this, just feels so, run through the Disney machine at this point. And the interesting thing, though, and I was reading this review, was about kind of what good and bad means like within this Star Wars universe. Because, I mean, you have this iteration of space Nazis, because that's what they are. They're space Nazis. And you have like the good side, but you have this kind of this undefined good and this undefined bad. And the review was kind of getting at the point of and I guess I can probably kind of pull it up to the review is by Eaton Wiesvogel, who has actually written stuff for Cinematary. But he had this really interesting point where he was talking about how the good and bad is just so very superficial in a way. You know, the good people, as he says in this film, good and evil are matters of attitude, not matters of ideology. The good care about their friends, cry for them when they die, cheer when they inevitably come back, carry out their duties with passion and joy, keep their energies up with humor. The bad sulk, rage, backstab, give in to their worst instincts. The message is simple: as long as you carry yourself with the right attitude, you will always be on the side of the good. And I was thinking about that and how that's kind of become not the default just for Star Wars, but the default for our blockbusters in general, where there's no strong ideology within the good and the bad. It's literally you're good because you feel like you're good inside, not because there's any like concrete moral reasons why this person is better than this person. And I was thinking about how that's such a massive disservice to just our mythology in general, because like that's the role of mythology and folklore over just the history of storytelling. Is it's supposed to kind of give you this moral standing of this is good and this is bad, and kind of interrogate society in a way that makes you kind of reflect on how, you know, where you fit within the micro, you know, that whole space. And I feel like having this like vague, we need to please everything mentality is just, again, this is not just a Star Wars thing. This is I think just a cultural thing. And I was thinking about that review a lot after reading it, that this is just kind of an example of where our blockbusters are headed, because there's no ideological or moral center to any of this. It's just, if you feel like you're good, you're a good person. And I'm just kind of like, nope, that's not how it is. So yeah, Rise of Skywalker, it's in theaters now. I don't recommend seeing it, quite honestly. Go watch something else. So it's such a stupid, and if we want to talk about technical stuff, it's so poorly directed. I mean, I don't even know. It's the action scenes are I've seen like better edited TikToks than I've seen action sequences in this movie. I swear to God, it's bad. Yeah, it's no good.
That's disappointing.
Michael, I'd be kind of curious to hear your thoughts on, I don't know if you're a big Star Wars person, but I think as somebody who like watches a lot of like, not only just like blockbusters, but like Disney blockbusters, I'd be kind of curious to get your thoughts on where this is headed in terms of what they're trying to do with this franchise under the whole Disney, you know, umbrella. Because
yeah, I used to be a huge Star Wars fan, like reading the extended universe novels and everything. So I've fallen out of that, but middle school me was hardcore into this, and
yeah,
I'm gonna see it.
I know Nathan was kind of a similar person. He's become so soured on it. So, like I said, we'll probably talk about it next week. So I'll be curious to hear some thoughts. But that's my initial thing. The movie I'd much rather talk about, because it's much more interesting, is Little Women, which also came out on Christmas weekend or Christmas week, and it's the follow-up by Greta Gerwig to Lady Bird. She wrote and directed this. It's the adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's novel, which has been adapted many times. But this version stars Saoirse Ronan, Emma Watson, Florence Pugh, Laura Dern, Meryl Streep, Timothy Chalamet, Chris Cooper, Bob Odenkirk, Tracy Letts. It has a bunch of people, a bunch of crossover with Lady Bird as well. And for those who are unfamiliar with the story, it follows these four sisters who live in Massachusetts who are coming of age in the United States. The story it bounces between 7 years before and the present. The present for them is kind of about 7 to 10 years removed from the Civil War. When they bounce back into the past a lot, and they're dealing a lot with their father has left to go fight for the Union. And they're just at home with their mother, who's played by Laura Dern. It's for the most part, it's just the kind of their lives. I don't really feel like going too much. This has been adapted like 1,000 times, and I feel like people probably at least know the story of Little Women. What I really I haven't watched many of the other adaptations of this, but I really enjoyed this version. I mean, I was a big fan of Lady Bird. I can see why Greta Gerwig was interested in this. I mean, this is a movie that's kind of overwhelmed with passion and female camaraderie, and just it's just for a movie that has a lot of kind of sad, bittersweet, melancholic moments. It's a very uplifting, positive, inspiring movie. I think it's aided a lot by performances by like Saoirse Ronan, who very much carries herself with like that strong-willed, passionate attitude that her character in Lady Bird has. She seems like a natural progression in terms of character and why she would take this role. But I think all of the actresses, from Emma Watson to Florence Pugh to Eliza Scanlon, who plays the fourth sister, like just them together, and the spirit that they all have in terms of kind of making it through, solving problems, having Laura Dern as kind of this kind of matriarchal, saintly character. It's just one of those movies where you have all of these different faces and you have all of these different events happening. The movie moves very quickly. I've seen a lot of people kind of complaining about the editing in it. The editing honestly didn't bother me too much. I feel like this is probably a conversation to talk about with no offense to you all, but with people who have like seen the movie. I think it moves at like this pace where it's a movie that's about kind of tying memories to the present and tying the past to the present, and it has kind of this frenetic energy where it shifts from, in one moment it's 7 years in the past, and then the next moment it's in the present. And I feel like that turned a lot of people off, and a lot of people complain about the editing style, but to me it worked, because I think as like a movie that's trying to recollect and make sense of memories, I think that kind of the frantic energy of that just seems natural. I don't think there's any like I don't know. To me, it makes more sense to kind of work to kind of function in that way, rather than like kind of slowing it down and letting everything kind of roll out in this kind of long drawn fashion. I don't think that's kind of what Greta Gerwig wants to accomplish. I mean, it didn't seem like the same thing she wanted to do in Lady Bird. This was a movie I really, really enjoyed.
Didn't people complain about the
what?
Didn't people complain about the Lady Bird as well?
I think so. I don't know if it's the same editor. Let me see. Let's see if it's the same guy who did Lady Bird. It is the same person.
Yeah, because it's really sharply edited. A lot of the scenes, kind of almost cut short in really striking ways in Lady Bird.
It does that a little bit, but I think like I said, I think to me it made sense within what it was trying to accomplish, and I think that it's able to establish the settings through not only just kind of telling what the performances are, but what the actresses are doing in terms of performances, whether they're 13 years old to 20 years old, but also just through through basic mise en scène. I mean, it's just the lighting. You can tell there's this really fantastic moment late in the film where it's a similar situation where something happens with one of the characters, and first you have, it's kind of in the flashback, you have this kind of warm coloring, and the Saoirse Ronan character is going downstairs and is worried about what happens, and it's like this very positive moment, and you can tell she's kind of recollecting that, because then in the second, it cuts to the present day, and she's kind of reacting to the scene in a similar fashion, but you can just tell from the lighting and the way that Gerwig sets up the entire sequence that it's set up in the same way, but you're cued by the lighting that it's in a much more negative light than what you saw before. And I think she has a lot of moments like that where she's kind of telling you through the cinematic techniques, what she's trying to tell, what she's trying to say, and what she's trying to say at like what time period it is. I think it's a really smart movie. I think it's a for being like an adaptation of kind of an older novel, I think she's able to infuse a modern spirit into it without overmatching it. And I think that she's able to kind of keep it modern while also keeping it engaging. She's not like trying to make it like a PBS masterpiece, movie. So I really enjoyed it. I would recommend people go and check it out, but Little Women, it's in theaters now. So yeah, very much recommend that. But Michael, I'm going to toss it over to you. You saw 2 movies this past week.
Yeah. So the first movie I saw, which is probably the more likely of the 2 that people have heard of, although they're both on Netflix and both have had some marketing through Netflix. The first one I saw is the most recent Bob Dylan documentary directed by Martin Scorsese. And so the title of this movie is Rolling Thunder Revue, a Bob Dylan story by Martin Scorsese. Like, that's the whole title. Apparently, according to Wikipedia and the title card in the movie. This movie is about, in the mid 70s, so like 1974 and 75, Bob Dylan went on the Rolling Thunder Revue concert tour, in which basically he kind of was reflecting that like he'd been playing lots of big cities and he felt like he had gotten away from like where people could actually see him, unless they wanted to buy like tickets to Madison Square Garden or something like that. And so he arranged this this tour. It was a really idiosyncratic tour where you go intentionally to like smaller venues, like somewhere in Hartford, Connecticut, or like upstate New York, or Tallahassee, Florida, or places that are like not like A-list like concert cities. And he would go and perform in those cities in intentionally small venues. And while at the same time doing these really like kind of cryptic like theatrics on stage. So he like wore this like white face makeup the whole time, and like he would bring up, like he had this like revolving door of musicians who he'd collaborate with on stage, like Joan Baez, or Allen Ginsberg is not a musician, but Allen Ginsberg would show up and do like poetry and things like that. I was not super. I'm familiar with Bob Dylan's studio recordings of like this time. So this is like around the time of Desire, and I think right before or right after Blood on the Tracks. But regardless, I was familiar with the studio recordings, but I didn't know a ton about this concert tour. I guess if you had been following the bootleg series that Bob Dylan has been putting out, it was live recordings from this tour were part of the bootleg series. So the movie itself kind of goes back and forth between live footage of like Bob Dylan and like his company performing at these venues, these really energetic, like impassioned performances that are like, strikingly different than the studio recordings. Like, so he'll do like old songs, like, Mr. Tambourine Man or something like that, but it's with rock instrumentation. Like this kind of like mid 70s, like Southern rock sound. He's of course got like Hurricane and the Desire stuff. So like, that's really exciting. But then the concert or the documentary also switches to talking head interviews from present day. So he has like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and different people who are involved, like reminiscing on the tour. And then he also has behind the scenes footage, which is sort of spliced in from a movie that I guess Bob Dylan directed, which I hadn't heard of until this movie came out. But the movie is called Ronaldo and Clara, which was Bob Dylan wrote and directed it, and it starred him and Joan Baez. And they filmed it during the tour. so that's all really interesting. But the hook of this documentary is that the a lot of this, a lot of the talking head footage that's reminiscing over the tour is faked. And so you have a documentary where, for instance, Sharon Stone is interviewed, and she is saying that she was in this, like, met Bob Dylan on this tour, and Bob Dylan wrote songs about her and stuff like that. And it's all just completely like fallacious. But the documentary doesn't signal that that's the case. And there's other things too. So like the footage from the movie is staged as if, or presented as if, like, this is actual real stuff that happened on the tour, when in reality it was, you know, kind of from a scripted fictional movie, just cut so it seems like it's, you know, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez just talking backstage. So it's this really tricky movie, especially for someone like me who's not like super familiar with the tour, to engage with, because it's like a documentary that is full of fiction, which I thought was, like, honestly, I thought it was great, because it really gets into the spirit of a lot of the fun things about Bob Dylan, like the kind of like mythology about Bob Dylan, you know, because there's a lot of information about Bob Dylan that Bob Dylan himself intentionally like obscured about himself, and a lot of, you know, Bob Dylan's stance with the press throughout his career has been kind of adversarial and like telling half truths and things like that. And so like this documentary really feels in the spirit of like what Bob Dylan is interested in. And I just think that that's really, really interesting on a conceptual level. And it's just really fun. Like once you start like picking up on like a lot of this stuff is not true, or if you have like Wikipedia open or reading about it, it's kind of hilarious and audacious. So like Sharon Stone is sitting there saying that like Bob Dylan wrote Just Like a Woman about her, which doesn't, the math of like Sharon Stone's age and the release of that song doesn't add up at all. And so it's just like really, really hilarious in this playful way. So I think this movie is great because it works as like a great concert doc, because you see all this like amazing like footage of like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and people playing. But B, it also works as this weird like conceptual piece about like the identity of Bob Dylan. And it's very fun and playful. And I think it's way better than the other Bob Dylan documentary that Martin Scorsese directed, which is called No Direction Home, which is like fine, but it's very like buttoned up and straight laced and stuff. This is very playful and off the cuff and weird, in a way that seems to fit with the spirit of both the Rolling Thunder Revue tour and also just Bob Dylan himself. So that's on Netflix. I think it's a great time. It's like 2.5 hours long, but at least for me, it didn't feel that long, because it's a pretty briskly paced movie with like the concert footage spliced with the other stuff. So that's one movie I saw, which is good. The other movie, and I won't go as long on this one, is also on Netflix. It's called Atlantics. It's the debut feature by a woman whose name I'm going to mispronounce because it's French, and I don't do great with French, but it's like Mati Diop. I don't know. She was an actress on 35 Shots of Rum, the Claire Denis movie. You've seen that. So that's where I knew her from. But so this is her debut feature, I believe.
Yes.
And it is set in Senegal. And it's this kind of strange, magical, realist story that begins with the labor dispute among a bunch of construction workers who have been busy constructing this enormous skyscraper and apparently have not been getting paid. And so there's like several minutes of like, you know, kind of the grumbling among the workers, who then all return home. And when the workers return home, we follow this one worker who is in a romantic relationship with the woman who turns out to be our protagonist, a woman whose name I am forgetting. Oh, it's Ada, a woman whose name is Ada. And the thing with Ada is that she's in love with this man, but she's betrothed to somebody else. And so there's this kind of conventional veneer over the movie where you have these, you know, this forbidden love almost, because, you know, her fiance is rich and her family wants her to be with him and all this sort of stuff. And this guy is a construction worker and, you know, et cetera. But about probably 15 or 20 minutes into the movie, it starts getting kind of strange. So the construction workers all leave the town basically in protest of like, we're tired of not being paid. So they all leave on a boat without telling any of their loved ones or whatever, because I guess they're going to go find work elsewhere or something. It's a little opaque because we're following the people left behind rather than the people who leave. And then as soon as they leave, just strange things start happening, increasingly so over the movie. You get people like starting to be like what appears to be possessed. You get people who like get taken with this mysterious illness that's like a fever. You get like strange visitations where like people will say they saw something and they didn't. And it all kind of culminates in kind of this interesting thing that kind of tries to tie together the romantic elements of the story and the kind of political labor elements of the story. I thought it was really good. It takes a little while to get going. Like when I first thought it was just, I wasn't as interested. And once it gets into the kind of supernatural stuff, I think it gets much more interesting. But throughout, the film just looks gorgeous. It is really lushly filmed. You get it's not a particularly like slow movie or a like an impenetrable art house movie or something, but you'll get occasionally just these shots of like just the sea, like the horizon with like the sun, that are just gorgeous, or random household objects will get like a shot that's just a couple of seconds long, and it's always staged really interesting and framed really interestingly. There's a scene that's in a bar that kind of becomes a motif throughout the movie, where the bar just has these like almost like you see those like projected Christmas lights people have on their house, like the green and blue Christmas like projection lights that they'll have, and the whole bar is just awash in those. And so all the characters walking through the bar are just like covered in these like luminescent dots, and it just looks really gorgeous. And then eventually the story goes some pretty interesting places as well. So like I said, this is also on Netflix. It's definitely the one that's been less advertised by Netflix, but both of them were recommended to me by the algorithm. So perhaps they will be recommended to you too.
Cool. No, I've heard great stuff about Atlantics. I think it played, if not TIFF, at one of the film festivals, and I've seen it on a lot of people's top 10 lists.
It was up for like the Palme d'Or at Cannes.
Oh, cool. That might have been it.
I think because let me pull up Wikipedia, because I thought I read this when I was getting the page. So the director, whose name I'm gonna butcher, but Mati Diop, she, I guess, is the first Black woman to ever be a director whose film was featured in competition at Cannes. That is
check. It's Cannes. The Cannes not really on the good side of history ever, so
yeah. I guess it won the Grand Prix as well.
Very cool. I've heard nothing but good stuff. It's one that I've been meaning to catch up with. So very nice. Gabby, you had a couple that you wanted to see. The first one was Knives Out, which we talked about a little bit on the pod a couple weeks ago, but I'm curious to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, I really like this movie, actually. I love the idea of it being just like a modern whodunit. For those unfamiliar with like the narrative of the story, it's after the mysterious and apparent suicide of a fiction mystery writer, a private detective has been called in to look over the case and see if there's any foul play. It's incredible to see how many people are in this film. It has Daniel Craig, Chris Evans, Jamie Lee Curtis, Michael Shannon, Don Johnson, Toni Collette, like Lakeith Stanfield. It has like an incredible range of different people and abilities, and I like that they come from a lot of different genres of film, and so they're all coming together in this place and having this very Clue feeling, but in an updated way that makes it feel like really immersive. So as the story unfolds, you I don't want to like share anything because this movie hasn't really been out for like too long, only for about a month or so. But it really kind of engages everybody in the audience as far as like not allowing you to be settled with one thing. Like everyone has a motive, really. Everyone has opportunity. This mystery writer, his name is Harlan Thrombey, is just seen as just like this almost oracle of like money and things, and people and you see like just a pattern of people using and abusing him in order to get what they want, and then at the very end, he's using that and just completely changing the situation on a lot of different people, which gives them the opportunity to strike back at him. It was really interesting seeing Daniel Craig with the Southern accent. It kind of threw me off guard at first, because as soon as he opened his mouth, like he's like, "Well, hello there, I do declare, let's figure out this thing." And he's supposed to be a French detective too, so that really, his name is Detective Blanc, and even Chris Evans' character in it was like, "So let Foghorn Leghorn in here," and it's just, but I like that little addition to him as a person, and it was just something that I think that widened my perception of Daniel Craig, because every other time I just see him in a like fancy ass suit kicking ass, so like just seeing him in a comedic role was really amazing as well. But yeah, I
saw an interview that said with Ryan Johnson, the director, who said that in the script he wrote like just kind of a subtle Southern accent, and then Daniel Craig came in with that, and it made everybody laugh, so they were like, yeah. We're leaving that in because that's hilarious.
I definitely get it, because it added just like a sense of just, of course there's like the mystery of the murder, but then it's just a sense of whimsy in that like you can enjoy this while it's still being a pretty serious topic as far as an apparent suicide, and I like that they also did not shy away from the characterizations of just shitty entitled people. And there is a woman that was helping Harlan, and she became his really good friend. Her name was Marta within the film, and like every single family member, they had like professed that she was family. They had known her for years, but every single one of them got her like country of origin wrong. They were like, "Oh yeah, she's like a Mexican," or like, "Oh yeah, she's like some kind of Guatemalan or something," and just little things like, or that's not little, but just there are markers everywhere where it's just like leading up to their just complete lack of awareness in not only what they're, or in some sense it is a complete awareness, but they just don't care. But they made a point of including different, not only stereotypes, but different perspectives of labeled people. So like they were making fun of SJWs at the same time. They were making fun of one of the characters' son is like this little want to punch you in the face like teen Nazi, and they were making fun of him because he was acting like a little brat and trolling people online, and they're like, "What are you doing? You're 13, sit down," like, and made a point of poking fun at all of these different people that for whatever reason they feel as though they have a moral high ground. Even Toni Collette is the daughter-in-law of Harlan, and she is just in one scene seen like praising like the proud immigrants that we have, but then in another one like being like, "Marta, can you get me something, please? I'm going to go meditate in my room," So it's just playing both sides of and demonstrating how both sides have weaknesses as far as any kind of moral superiority, because that doesn't really exist when you're surrounded in a situation of entitlement. It is like I think that it's a really good movie if you just want to enjoy a story without necessarily having to be 100% emotionally invested, as in like, this movie's not going to make me cry. It'll make me laugh more than anything else, but then you still feel like a part of it, and there are still moments where you just cringe while you're watching it that I really enjoy as well. I would definitely recommend watching it, and just at the very least being able to see Chris Evans, his character Ransom, act like a total brat. I think that he had a lot of fun playing his character Ransom as just like this entitled shitboy, just especially after being Captain America. He can just be like this horrible person and kind of relish in it, and I think that he really did throughout his performance, so I really like that as well. But I would definitely kind of recommend something if you just want to enjoy a story and engage with it on a not 100% emotionally investing level as far as pain, but just pure enjoyment. You know what I mean? Like
it's a really for like it's I think we talked about it whenever it came out. It's like a great kind of cast, kind of big premise, not really big premise, but like a big studio movie that is not Marvel, Disney, etc. That's just kind of fun. That I think everybody who I've talked to has gone and seen it's been like kind of a fun theater going experience. And I feel like we need more of those we need more movies kind of like this that are outside the Disney realm of like products that are in the movie theater. Like this is a nice kind of alternative.
And I like that it doesn't, I don't know if there will ever be a sequel or anything like that, but it's completely unnecessary for it to have one. Like, it doesn't have to extend into this, like, crazy long franchise. It can just be on its own. And I really kind of appreciated that, especially after so many different franchises that have been coming out. Although a lot of them have been fantastic and they have produced really good films, it can be kind of tiring to be like, oh shit, okay, so I need to watch the 7th film of this, and being able to kind of section out independent stories and then having them be contained in a single film sometimes can just be really refreshing. And I think it was for this one as well.
I have a confession to make, which is that over Thanksgiving weekend, I had the choice to see this or Frozen 2. And I saw Frozen 2.
Michael, no.
I'm sorry to let you know.
Michael, no.
Well,
how was Frozen 2?
The decision was really made because of showtimes, not because of one movie over the other. But I'm part of the problem, Zach.
You and everybody else that has a kid, I'm sure.
I love that the voice actress for Elsa, the voice actress for Elsa just publicly apologized to all of these parents. She's like, I'm so sorry. I did this to you. Your kids are going to be singing this for the rest of their lives. I'm sorry. I know. And just being completely upfront with her, just like, involvement. And like, this is your part of your life now. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen the first Frozen. It was one of my niece's favorite movies. And after a while, she got tired of watching it in English, so she started switching it up and be like, you know what, I'm going to watch Frozen in Spanish. And started, doing that, or in French, so she can mix it up, but it's still the same thing, so you're still hearing Let It Go 67 times in a day. Just now it's in Spanish or French. So, yeah.
This is another topic, but I really enjoy listening to the dubs on cartoons for different languages because the voice actors always have like a different take on what the character should be like. I think that's always very fun, but I personally wouldn't really watch Frozen.
Yeah, it's cool to hear the different voices, but yeah, after hearing Let It Go in Spanish already, it's like, all right, I'm good. I'm extra good on it.
Very cool. Well, we're getting kind of tight on time, so we're going to go ahead and head into part 2. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back talking about 2018 after this.
Hey, Cinematariats, this is your co-host Lydia Creech with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we definitely want your money. We still want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema, but now we're getting into the Patreon game, baby. We've brought on a lot of new voices to contribute to the site, and we want to honor our responsibility to compensate all these smart people for their hard work. To help us out, head over to patreon.com/cinematary to sign up at the $5 a month level. In exchange, our patrons will get an exclusive bonus episode every month, weekly shoutouts on each episode of the show, and the ability to dictate a movie for us to cover eventually. If money's tight, we get it. There are still a few things you can do that we would greatly appreciate. First, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That's free to help us reach more listeners. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send an email to Zach@cinematary.com. That's Zach, Z-A-C-H, to let us know your thoughts, and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think would enjoy listening to and participating in our film discussions we put out every week. So, to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, share with your friends and family, and sign up to be a patron. We would truly appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show.
And we are back with part 2 of episode 279 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Best of the Decade series with 2018. Fresh off this one, if you would like to go back, you're welcome to listen to our Best of the 2018 movies podcast that we did last year. But I figure we can talk a little bit about... there's a few topics that we're going to kind of do that kind of carry over from 2018. They move around throughout the decade, but also I think that 2018 is a good placeholder to kind of talk about them. The first is kind of where faith-based movies lie within the past decade. And I think that you have a movie that came out in 2018 that I believe was our highest ranked movie on Cinema. I can't remember. It's, so long ago. It's God's Not Dead 3. We love that movie. It was honestly Andrew's favorite movie of all time, but he would just be quiet about it. He still hasn't figured out if he's dead or not. But the movie is First Reformed, the film written and directed by Paul Schrader. It starred Ethan Hawke and Amanda Seyfried. We talked extensively about that last year. Nathan had a really good review on the site. But I feel like you kind of have like these two brands of faith-based movies, because I think you have like the movie like First Reformed. Another of like that ilk that I would throw in there is the John Michael McDonough movie from 2016 or 2015, Calvary, with Brendan Gleeson. You kind of have like these types of faith-based movies, which very much are like reckoning with religion and faith and the kind of the tenets that you would assume most faith-based movies would have. But then you also have the God's Not Dead, I Can Only Imagine. I saw a preview when I went and saw Little Women for some movie called I Still Believe, about like some dude who's a Christian singer whose like girlfriend's gonna die in the hospital, and he has to, he like prays to save her. So you have like these this brand of faith-based movie that seems to appeal more to the church-going crowd as like a event to get church groups out to the movie theaters, but also appeal to kind of that more evangelical ilk of moviegoers. But Michael, I know this was a topic that you brought up kind of in relation to First Reform, so I'm kind of curious, I guess first what you made of that movie, and then second, what you've made of kind of the faith-based genre at large over the past decade.
I mean, I think First Reformed is great. I probably contributed. I don't remember what I voted for last year, but I probably contributed to it being the favorite movie of Cinematary. So First Reformed is very good, and it involves like the stuff that So I'm a Christian. I go to church and all this, and the stuff that I find meaningful about faith appears in First Reformed, right? So this, real wrestling with really complex moral topics, and just feelings of like, reflection, and then even like the kind of stuff that I'm sure like, churches would tend to not like happen, but definitely do in the faith experience as well. Like, crippling doubt, that sort of thing. And as Ethan Hawke's character finds, like, butting your head up against like the kind of bureaucratic self-sustaining system that is like, any sort of organization, but certainly churches as well. So I love First Reformed quite a bit. And I think it presents a really compelling view of like the psychological realities of like, being a Christian in the modern day. Whereas God's Not Dead and its ilk, those things are basically like they're satanic. Basically, I hate them so much. And I hate them for a lot of reasons. Like, one, suck on just an aesthetic level. There's no sense of like image or anything, especially the first one, which I think came out in 2014. But also just as far as like, their depiction of religion goes and the Christian faith, I think is just so incredibly bland and shallow, even within the milieu that they're doing, which like First Reformed is like a kind of it's not high church, but it's basically a mainline church in First Reformed, which is much different from like the evangelical Christian context that like God's Not Dead is working in. But even within, the evangelical framework, which is much different from like a mainline framework, it is just such a tedious depiction of that, and really bizarrely like offensive one too. This is God's Not Dead 3 came out in 2018, so I guess we can talk about that. But like the first two movies are actually like maybe more like they're worse movies for sure. I've watched all three of them as a hate watch thing. But the first one involves like the kind of meme that you may have heard of if you grew up in like conservative evangelical spaces, which I did, where there's this atheist philosophy professor and he has all his students the first day of philosophy class write "God is dead," because that's definitely what Nietzsche meant when he said that. And by God is dead, he means that God doesn't exist, and you guys have to admit that God doesn't exist in order to pass my class. And so like this movie is like, this student has to debate this philosophy professor who's just this raging atheist who is not even like a real atheist by the end of the movie. Like it turns out that he's just mad at God because someone in his family died or something like that. And so he's mad at God about that, and then by the end of the movie, he's hit by a car. And as he's like bleeding out on the sidewalk, some pastor runs up and saves him. And he says like the sinner's prayer and then dies. And so it's just like incredibly offensive and a very shallow engagement with, the ideas of atheism and any sort of faith outside of like evangelical Christian faith, and just as different from First Reformed as you can imagine. But I think that these movies are interesting to talk about because they're really important movies, like culturally, I think, in ways that don't get discussed because they suck. Like these movies suck. So obviously people aren't going to talk about them who aren't like its target audience. But like if you go through, so PureFlix is the studio that produced God's Not Dead. And God's Not Dead was its like big claim to fame, although it had been producing movies for several years prior to that. But with God's Not Dead, it found like basically a cash cow. So God's Not Dead had a budget of $2 million, but it got $64 million in the box office, which is a huge, that's a huge profit margin. And all of these movies, all these Christian movies are made on the cheap and have huge margins of profit. And in some movies, so like there's a movie, this isn't a PureFlix movie. This is a movie called Heaven is for Real by what's called Affirm Films, which is a Sony imprint. Or not imprint, that's publishing, but it's a Sony subsidiary. This movie, Heaven is for Real, which came out in 2014, the same year as the first God's Not Dead movie, it has a budget of $12 million and grosses over $100 million. So like a lot of people see these movies, and I think it's under discussed, like the just the impact these movies have on like film culture in general, which I think is pretty big. I think that there's now like a whole like subgenre of like movies by conservatives for conservatives that I think is sort of couched in like what God's Not Dead and that sort of thing do. Because if you look at like the 2000s, there are some faith-based movies that do good business, like Facing the Giants and stuff like that, but they're not ideologically motivated. So Facing the Giants, you have like, it's all about the power of prayer and et cetera, which is just kind of blandly Christian. But with these kind of movies like God's Not Dead, there's a real like conservative chip on its shoulder regarding its stance toward culture at large. And this like really combative stance, which I think is kind of probably born out of its coming out of, the Obama years when evangelical Christianity really doubled down on the persecution complex. But I mean, I think that that whole stance toward culture, where you have to create your own media in a sort of separate ecosystem that's antagonistic toward, the quote unquote like mainstream, is like really pernicious and widespread. And like there's even a PureFlix streaming service, which I think like kind of encapsulates like the role of streaming services now, which is like each one is starting to increasingly find its own niche, whether that's, a Disney niche or a whatever niche. Like, this is the conservative Christian niche of streaming services. I just think these movies are endlessly fascinating to talk about just on a cultural level. I've talked a lot, that I should open up the floor for somebody else.
It's interesting that you say that as far as like conservative audiences having like their own subsect as well, because it reminds me a lot of the all the controversy with the Hallmark films that have been coming out recently, and how people have freaked out because there was one that featured a Jewish couple, and in the movie it was all about how the Jewish couple had to give up parts of their culture in order to be like, what, you just need more Christmas, that's really about it, and just like, or you see these ladies kissing, I don't think so, and it's always just kind of an affront of like, I'm going to believe what I'm going to believe in. Either people have to fall in line of that or accept that and respect that without any of the same courtesy being extended. And like, that's what really bothered me about this movie is like one of the characters who, it was like the young Muslim woman who like, became a secret Christian, and then her dad just freaked out and then, disowned her, was just being horrible to her. Or, even like setting up the antagonist as being an atheist philosophy professor, where it's just like, I just have to prove a point to prove it, like, because there's no, it's not even like any sense of it, and it's not any sense of realism in that, like, we're not even going to the movies for realism. But if I'm watching a movie and my atheist philosophy professor is like, what you have to do to pass my class, sign a paper that says God is dead, then immediately it's like, and his whole achieving moment is just quote unquote proving that he's not, is just, this whole argument is completely asinine in that, like, even if he was alive or whatever, I'm just trying to pass a class, man. Like, or, and just putting your students through that, or feeling so persecuted that you have to go through all this trouble, and then, having the students at the end all stand up and be like, God is dead, solidarity, yeah, and then walk out, and it's like, what is this? Yeah, like,
it's worth noting. I mean, you bring up
this is for a very specific people.
You bring up the Muslim character, and it's worth noting, like, the first two, and the third one's a little bit different. I don't know if you've seen it, but like the first two, like, are all premised on like anything that's not Christian is bad. So the second movie has like the ACLU come in, and they're just like Lucifer incarnate, and then you of course have the Muslim family in this one, who is like just immediately abusive to their child as soon as they divert from like the beliefs of Islam. And there's no acknowledgement that Christianity is capable of the same abuses or anything like that. It's just this really starkly defined, like, Christians are right, everybody else is terrible, the end, and I hate it.
Which is, it's such a stark difference from something of like the First Reformed, Calvary, or even another one I would toss in there from this past year, A Hidden Life ilk, which are movies that are very much, none of them I feel like are, I don't know, maybe I'll be wrong on First Reform, but none of them are necessarily anti-Christian. It's just, it's much more in investigating, the difference between what religion is and what like having faith is, and like the degrees, the levels of difficulty it is to kind of keep that the strength in faith, which I agree with you, Michael, I find to be remarkably more compelling than anything like A God's Not Dead or any of those other movies of that same fashion are presenting you, because at the end of the day, those are pretty much just like evangelical fantasies that they're putting in the movie theaters. It's just something that kind of, it's not really challenging them on anything. It's just kind of affirming the position that they already had coming in the movie theater. It's not leaving them with any questions or literally anything that they have to think about. And that's why I've really enjoyed Calvary, First Reformed, and A Hidden Life, because those are movies that kind of provoke this level of thought related to faith, especially faith, like in, like you said, the modern culture, where I think that the kind of the direction that that a lot of evangelicals are taking, it's a lot more about what's on a moral level than, you know, showing up and, you know, showing up at church and having like a cross necklace. You know, it's kind of, I think that those movies, the narratives themselves are compelling because it's kind of making you reckon with your level of faith and how dedicated you are to those tenets. And I think something like First Reformed also, like, it goes another level just because it adds that, like you had mentioned at the top, the kind of bureaucratic capitalistic level, which is something that it's kind of interesting that a lot of churches are dealing with, because you have a lot of that where let me just an example. So I was in church for Christmas Eve this year, and I wasn't there for the sermon because I don't live where I was at Christmas Eve, but also I don't go to church. And the pastor was talking about how he gave this sermon in November about politics, and and how he's like, I know everybody was groaning because what's this pastor got to say? And I was like, well, you shouldn't be ashamed of that. Literally, pastors from the beginning of time have been getting political, but that's fine. And he literally made the statement where he pretty much said, don't worry about which political party you align on, as long as you trust in Jesus, you're fine.
Wait, man, I went to a Christmas service that said basically the same thing.
Right?
Oof.
So I guess that was the theme of this Christmas Eve, and I feel like that's just again going into. I bring up this example because I think this is going into the kind of bureaucratic capitalistic side of churches today, because I guarantee, one, he's wanting to like not offend people, but also he's probably getting the voices from upstairs going, you know, you can't offend this large swath of the congregation because that's where the money is. Like, you can't, you're about to also, you just did the offering plate, you know, a turn before this. You can't offend all those people who just donated all this money into the different church initiatives. And I feel like that's something that First Reformed does on that's really interesting, that I think it's something that the Christian church, especially in America, really has to kind of, that's a facet that I would like to see more of, and that I think that's kind of an interesting take that movie, or direction that movie goes into. Right.
And I think it's telling that, like, you know, the hook, I guess, of God's Not Dead and like several of these other Christian movies is the idea that, like, you know, culture has moved on from Christianity and is antagonistic to Christianity. So what does it mean to, you know, be a Christian in a culture like this? And First Reformed and a movie like Silence, which is another, I think, of the great like faith films of the last decade, or like, you know, some of the other ones you mentioned are kind of about that. Like, you know, these movies are definitely about like people of faith who are adrift in a culture that, you know, doesn't really, they're no longer at the center of the culture, right? And it's you know, in a lot of respects, it's about that. Like, how does a person of faith navigate a world that's either indifferent or antagonistic toward your beliefs? And so in a way, these movies are about the same thing, but which ones did the conservative Christians come out in droves to get, you know, $100 million in the box office for? It was the ones that ultimately had nothing critical or self-reflexive to say about Christianity. You know, there's nothing. There was no challenge to the Christian hierarchy. The answer to how do you engage with culture is you fight culture because it's wrong, not that you self-reflect or anything like that. And I, you know, that feels like a microcosm of, like, in general, a lot of the just the Christian culture of the 2010s that I experienced. And so I am always refreshed when something like First Reformed comes around.
Yeah. Gabby, have you seen First Reformed? What did you make of that movie?
Yeah, I did see it. I really liked it a lot. I personally I'm not a religious person either, but I can really appreciate, and they have religious people in compromising positions of like, yeah, now you have to acknowledge that one, in a lot of different ways, your religion, and not necessarily, or your religion has been used as a weapon against a lot of people, and a lot of harm has come from that. You have to acknowledge that, and at the same time, it's not always easy, or even it doesn't even feel like it's worth it to believe in something like this. So I love the fact that they allow for, Ethan Hawke's character to just really engage in that. It's like, what am I even doing? Because you should be like, that's the whole point, right? Of even faith in itself is, even when you are tested, you find a way to validate it, but you have to be critical of it as well. And just thinking about other religious films that have come out, I mean, Dogma came out in '99, but I love that movie, and it's interesting to see how much criticism that movie gets, but ultimately it is not an anti-Christian movie at all. It's a movie that's actually praising a lot of really good things about it, but then also taking a critical eye and looking at things that have been perpetuated because of that, or just, how people have been manipulating any kind of message in order to justify doing horrible things. And I like when they take a moment to stand back and say, okay, look, we as people, we are human beings. And if we are given or if we're put in a situation of free will, then we're going to do what we're going to do. So how do you navigate that? And I did not expect, it was very dark in the best kind of ways. It reminds me a lot of I wish I remembered the name, but it's the Jake Gyllenhaal movie where he is a detective and he's trying to find the little girls. I'm gonna remember it in a minute, but where it just takes moments where people are at their worst or at one of their lowest points. I like the fact that they included, his addiction to alcohol, because that's a reality that a lot of people don't want to confront, as far as being in a religious situation or not, but especially when people are looking to you as a leader of a church, and especially because the church isn't doing well and he's using the house of God essentially as a form of making money, because people are going there as more of a tourist destination than being a practitioner in the church. But then also being directly confronted when the environmentalists are essentially terrorists, since he was trying to hurt other people as well, since he took on the mantra of that, but at the same time recognizing that it's not just, it's on one hand trying to put forward the belief system of are we correct, are we actually good stewards of the earth? Because I mean, especially through climate change in a lot of different ways, we are destroying God's creation. This is directly our fault. So how can we start over like God has done multiple times and just wipe everybody out and start over? Or is this a message that is that what you're saying, or you're acknowledging that there is just no such thing as clear-cut morality in that? So I definitely appreciate it, and it was just a visually beautiful movie too. I didn't expect that, or I didn't expect so much detail to be put on that, but then researching the director and stuff, I'm okay, that definitely makes sense, and that it has the depth of character and just the depth of cinematography that makes it a really compelling movie to watch. Although it was afterwards and seeing the ending and not really knowing, even the director has said I want it to be completely an opportunity for viewers to make it an interpretation instead of just this is what happened. And I love that you get a chance to decide for yourself whether, Ethan Hawke's character kills himself or not, whether he's with Amanda Seyfried or not, and allows for that moral and narrative ambiguity to kind of come together in that, was he even a good person, or is he validated in his extremism when you can see what has led up to that, and at the same time acknowledging maybe you can try and justify it, but you are doing things directly to hurt other people in the name of what, So I enjoyed this movie more than I thought. I have to admit that sometimes with religious movies, I have to have that little caveat, especially because I'm not religious, and I'm sometimes expecting it to be a situation where it's God's not dead or something like that. But then this gave a really subtle look into just a person being a person instead of this is completely right. This is real, I appreciate the realness of it.
Before we move on, I have a question. Have any of you guys seen God's Not Dead 3, which is actually the one that came out in 2018?
I haven't seen, I'll be honest, I haven't seen any of them, so no.
God's Not Dead 3 is super interesting because it's not good, but it does kind of address some of the stuff that we were just talking about, how like, the other movies aren't like self-critical or anything like that. God's Not Dead 3 is the only one that admits that the church is capable of abuse, and there's a whole character who's like left the faith because the church did some really terrible stuff to them. And then the kid from the first movie comes back, and like the student from the first movie, and he's like woke now, and he's talking about how Jesus is a social justice warrior and we should be like him. It's kind of wild. It's not particularly good, and it still has a sort of like it's still like kind of affirming to an obnoxious degree of like evangelicalism, but it's a really interesting instance of like, I don't even know, like it just went the franchise basically took a complete left turn with this movie. It's like a completely different creative team too and everything. Anyway, it's not good. Watch First Reformed instead, but it's interesting.
That should be the takeaway for all of this people listening to so far, the majority of this part 2. The next topic I kind of wanted to shift to, because this has been really on its head really in 2019 with Martin Scorsese and his comments about movie theaters and Disney, etc. After his latest movie, The Irishman, came out on Netflix, but there's a couple other auteurs who kind of made the shift to streaming, specifically with Netflix, kind of giving them, I feel like with Cuarón as well, just like a blank check to kind of make their, a movie that they've been wanting to make forever. So you have Alfonso Cuarón with Roma, which of course they pushed really hard for the Oscar, and then you have the Coen brothers who made The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, which initially was actually like planned as like a TV series, but then ended up becoming a movie, which is like the weird reversal of what we talked about last week. But I mean, do you all have any thoughts on kind of these directors who are kind of going to streaming services because the streaming services, specifically Netflix, especially with like Cuarón and Scorsese, are going like, yeah, you can just whatever you need, like you can make this passion project that you want to make. Here's a blank check, and kind of how that fits into the whole movie theaters are dying, that whole kind of debate. Because on one side, I mean, like with something like The Irishman, like I agree with Scorsese's like take that this would not have been made like in the studio system. Like this is the only way that it's going to be made, even though it has to be on Netflix. But at the same time, like hearing people who are like breaking it up into chunks and not sitting. I mean, I got to see. I luckily got to see it in a movie theater, and it was worth it because. I mean, if you watch it at home, you just have that threat of, checking your phone or just not paying attention. And I feel like it pays off to like be like in there, committed to it for that runtime. But at the same, it's kind of like a catch-22 at the same time. That movie probably wasn't made if Netflix didn't intervene. So I don't know. Do you all have kind of any thoughts on these directors heading to streaming services in order to make these big projects that they've been looking to do?
I would rather see them in theaters too, but kind of like you, Zach, if it's between them not being made or them being on Netflix or wherever, I'd rather have them on Netflix. Something that doesn't get brought up as much is how, and this is not a defense of Netflix, which I think has been actively antagonistic toward a lot of things I like, i.e. movie theaters, they got into a lot of heat for whether their intent to destroy the conventional movie experience, and then when they tried to switch to these prestige films, like the movie theater chains kind of reacted against that accordingly. And so like this is not like a glorification of Netflix, but one thing I will say is that even if these movies had gone to theaters through traditional means, they probably would not have been accessible to as many people as they were on Netflix. So case in point. I used to live in Jackson, Tennessee, because that's where I went to college. And there was 2 movie theaters there, and they all would just show basically, big studio blockbusters. there you get a few of the like Oscar movies, but very rarely would you get any of the ones that were like, you know, anything other than, you know, just the broadest stuff. Like I remember getting Zero Dark 30, you know, and that was kind of unique that we got that movie, and it wasn't just another, you know, big blockbuster. That was the sort of like Oscar movies you get. And so Netflix was really like a very positive presence in my life then, because it allowed me to have access to movies that would never, ever have made it to Jackson, Tennessee. And if I didn't want to drive to Memphis, then like Netflix was my next best option. And so like with the movie like Roma, not English language, in black and white, even if that had been released in theaters, I mean, that would have just been the same. You know, who would have watched that movie? Probably not any more people who already did. It would just be the critics would have gotten to see it in their preferred venue rather than on Netflix. And I think that there's something to be said for, if something is on Netflix, it's more likely to be watched by someone, provided Netflix advertises it enough, which they certainly did with Roma. That's not always the case with their direct to streaming movies, but I would rather see them in a theater too. But I do think that more people watch these movies when they're on Netflix.
Yeah, especially with like The Irishman. I mean, I'm sure more people are catching it on Netflix, where they, even though it's you know, it's probably making Scorsese sick. They're, you know, watching it in like 3 or 4 parts or whatever, like breaking it up. At the end of the day, I guess they're still watching it. So it's like, would you rather it's like, that's the kind of question I feel like we're headed to. Would you rather they watch it, but break it up, or watch it like on their own terms? Or would you rather they just not watch it, you know, within the parameters that you would like to see them? I mean,
right. Because I mean, it's not just the studio systems paying money for these movies to be made. It's that these movies are distributed by the studio system in ways that are inherently like hierarchical. You know, you go to New York and LA, and then you kind of roll out to the big metropolitan areas, you know, with these kinds of movies. You're not going to go, for the most part, you're not going to go to, you know, even mid-sized, you know, kind of towns. The way that studios and theater chains have chosen to do distribution is everybody gets the really expensive movies. Only a few areas get the you know, the movies that didn't cost as much. And so when people talk about like the death of the mid-budget drama or whatever, I mean, I think the distribution needs to be in conversation with that, because, you know, I can tell you in Jackson, Tennessee, we weren't getting Coen Brothers movies. You know, I didn't get A Serious Man in Jackson, Tennessee when I was living there. And it's not that I didn't want to watch it, it's that literally they wouldn't let me watch it. And so I have so many conflicting feelings about this, because I think Netflix does a lot of harm, but, you know, ultimately they are like in some ways democratizing viewing in a way that's kind of interesting, and that the studio system refuses to do, honestly.
Yeah. Gabby, do you have any thoughts on this? I know because you live in Atlanta, so they're a little bit better in terms, I mean, they're not New York or LA in terms of releases, but a lot of the smaller kind of mid-range movies that are going to get missed in like Jackson or even here in Savannah, at least get a shot on screens in Atlanta, just because I guess there's a little bit more in terms of interest and opportunities with the theater layout there.
Right. And you know, it of course definitely depends on what the movie is, and different theaters have like different release times and stuff like that. And I honestly love going to the movies. It's one of my favorite things to do, and actually be in that space. I will say, though, I really can appreciate Netflix in that, or just directors going straight to Netflix for television shows, but films as well, in that like it gives you more of an opportunity to understand and be with the material. When I watch a movie in the movie theater, you know, I can't control any part of the environment around me. So I mean, like, honestly, it can be some person like texting on their phone, you know, 5 rows down, and I can see it and it's driving me crazy. Or it can, you know, like the environment may not be able to be controlled, or like things can always happen as far as you missing something, or just things are cut a certain way. But then Netflix gives you the opportunity to not only control your environment as far as like pausing or fast forwarding or whatever, but also just if you're ready to be really a part of it, then you have the opportunity to. If you need to go back and understand what they're even saying, because I mean, like half the time that people would struggle with watching movies, it's because they had missed something visually or audibly, and especially when things are really highly important, you want to be able to fully be a part of it. And so, like, I can definitely appreciate not only content-wise, but just like logistically wise, directors would like to have opportunities to be on Netflix, and Netflix affords like a lot of different more, or it seems that it just affords more risk, and that you're able to try different things and be able to have this space to, if this is the worst thing ever, ultimately there are hundreds of other things on any kind of streaming site that somebody can just click out of and just be done. It's like you don't have to fully invest yourself in, I don't want to watch this movie anymore. I don't feel gypped in that, like I've paid a certain amount for a ticket or something like that, and this isn't the experience that I wanted. But at the same time, that I can still be a part of this. And it is kind of sad, though. Directors may have perceived viewers seeing it as far as like movie theater versus Netflix, but at the same time, ultimately, I think that, like you guys said before, it would be better to come into contact with it at all in any capacity than just, not having either the opportunity to see it or it not being conducive to you actually, enjoying it for yourself.
One thing I will say that's maybe critical of Netflix's approach is the topic of like Netflix bloat, or in general, just the idea that it's not always the best idea to let a director or an artist do everything that they want. Sometimes the like constraints of like, the studio system or whatever are sometimes artistically beneficial. So like you mentioned that the Coen brothers were going to turn, I'm not sure if this is on air or not, but that the Coen brothers were going to turn The Ballad of Buster Scruggs. Originally it was going to be a TV series, but then they cut it down to a feature film. And I think that there are many, many examples of the opposite happening, where these, kind of prestigious directors were given, a budget to make a miniseries on Netflix or whatever, and they just did it regardless of whether or not it should have been a movie. The thing that's coming to mind for me is the Errol Morris documentary series Wormwood, which I think is a great example of a feature film stretched into a miniseries to its detriment. And I think that a lot of times these Netflix movies and or series suffer from like not enough constraints. And so the artist sometimes is allowed to do kind of indulgent things or just really slack pacing, or in their TV, a lot of times this results in like episode structures that are very slack and kind of blur together. So like, whereas the Coen brothers did choose to like, edit their series down into a movie. I don't know if that's always true of people that Netflix gives a blank check to. And I don't feel this way, but certainly there's probably someone out there who feels like the Irishman could have been shorter. And probably the studio, if it had been released theatrically, would have made it shorter. And it would have been interesting to see like, what does that do to the movie? Because I think once you get on Netflix and there's no real reason to have a movie be a certain length, that leads to some interesting formal stuff. But it can also just lead to just a lack of discipline as far as like what actually gets put into the film. And so I think that there are a lot of examples of the Netflix strategy not always serving the best interests of the movie.
I've heard some people say that in term related to The Irishman. I mean, they're wrong, but I've heard people say that.
Yeah, I disagree as well, but
I've definitely heard that comment made. So, cool. Well, I think that we, that's it'll be something that will probably come up. That's not going to be like this is the end of the conversation, because I think especially as the theaters become more, well, at this point, more just Disney movies. People are gonna have to find other avenues when it comes to watching that other fare, and it seems like as much as Martin Scorsese and people in New York and LA want us to see it in theaters, the rest of the country is going to be like, well, that sounds great for New York and LA people, but we don't have the same abilities and same amenities that you have. So I apologize.
Well, and also the trained habits, if you start training people not that the movie theater is just for Marvel movies or whatever, then that's just what they're going to be looking for at the movies as well. And I think that there's a sort of relationship here that, if the kind of movies you like are increasingly on Netflix, you're going to quit even checking out what's at the theater.
Yeah. It's also not to defend the movie theaters. It's like this beautiful sanctified space. Also, movie theaters kind of suck sometimes because they're just kind of like, I don't know about here. I don't know about you all, but here it's just like you have those movie theaters where it's just you have like one kiosk open. It feels like the whole place, the rest of the building is like a dust town, and they treat it that way. Spring, it's a little bit, come on, theaters, get on your level as well. I feel like, but cool. Well, I believe this will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at handle @Cinematary, on Instagram at Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all the movies that we talked about in this episode. Check out the Patreon channel. We have our new Film Theory and Chill. We talked about Tales of Sound and Fury, the essay by the late film theorist and historian Tomas Alcesser. We just posted that on Christmas Day, so if you were looking for a nice little get out of, you've been hanging out with the family for a long time, you want to listen to some film theory, we got that for you. Go to patreon.com/Cinematary. Thank you so much to our patrons: Cam, Chad Newsom, Christina Daughtry, Chris Metcalf, Cindy Roberts, Eric Dukowski, Graham Jones, Harry Eskin, Maggie, Marie Barty, Matthew Lingo, Miranda Barnwall, Ron Hayes, Tyler Chandler, Whitney Rio Ross. Thank you so much for supporting the website and supporting the show. We'll have hopefully some more good stuff for you all in the new year. But next week we will be kicking off 2020. This is the last Cinematary episode of 2019, guys. So we're going to be kicking off 2020 with the end of our Best of the Decade series, and that is our Best of 2019 episode. We'll be breaking down the top 10 of the year, so as picked by the Cinematary participants. So it'll be an interesting one. But yeah, until then, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.